Good afternoon friends, welcome to this final session on spark gears. So in the last two classes we had talked about the details of the spark gear geometry. In particular in the last class we have analyzed quite some details about the involute tooth profile, why it is necessary and what are the advantages where we get we get out of the involute tooth profile selection for the gears. So we will start today's class with a exercise problem which will sort of help you get clarified about the way the calculations are done. So here is the example problem which I would like to demonstrate. So here what is said is that a 19 tooth pinion is meshing with a 37 tooth wheel. The pressure angle is given as 20 degree and the module is 4 millimeter. You are asked to find different parameters for this gear train mechanism, starting with gear ratio, circular pitch, pitch diameter, pitch radius, center distance and so on. And you are asked to use the SI specifications, which you will recall I had mentioned as this one. This table gives exactly the SI specifications for addendum, dedendum and tooth thickness and so on. So here you are basically asked to apply all those formulae to solve this particular problem. The last part of the problem will elaborate the point that I mentioned in the last class, that due to assembly related issues it is expected that the nominal pitch diameter will not remain the same because the distance between the shaft centers is finally the sum of the radius of the pitch circle. So let me elaborate what I mean to say in this. Here we have two gears and I am just drawing the pitch circle of the two gears. So this is the larger one or the wheel. So these are the gear centers about which the gears are expected to rotate. So the distance between the shaft centers is going to be the sum of the distance. So the shaft center distance is RP1 plus RP2, the distance between the two shafts. So if you are required to transmit power between two shafts which are placed at a distance of S, then the condition obviously is S equals to RP1 plus RP2. But what happens during assembly process, it is not possible to exactly maintain this design shaft distance because of the assembly related manual errors. I would say this S will change to S prime, so it will slightly change, and for the example problem that I have taken, I have assumed that it is about 2% change in the shaft distance. So now S has changed to S prime. So what was the designed shaft distance S, that has changed to S prime. So that also means that RP1 prime plus RP2 prime is S prime, right. So the designed pitch circle radius will not be available in once the shaft distance is changed, but we will do this calculation to find out exactly what happens. But the base circle will be remaining same, but the base circle will be remaining same, right. And why is that? Because the base circle essentially implies that for a given involute tooth profile the base circle is fixed. Now obviously the gear has already been cut, the involute tooth profiles have already been generated. So merely changing the shaft distance between the two meshing gears will not change the base circle. So in other words, what we had seen in the last class was that RB was RP cosine phi, where phi is the pressure angle. So that essentially means that RP1 by RP2, if I call this M, which by the drawing is very clear that it is lesser than 1, then firstly you will have RP1 plus RP2 to be equal to the you will have RB1 plus RP1 plus RP2 to be equals to the distance S, which implies that RP2 into 1 plus M is equals to S, which implies RP2 will be S divided by 1 plus M. So that's the formula for the pitch circle radius in terms of the shaft distance. So M is just the gear ratio, if you may so call it. Now what happens is this, that when S changes to S prime, even then you will have RP1 prime by RP2 prime as same as RP1 by RP2, right? That is because again you will have the formula RB equals to RP cos phi to be valid. RB does not change, phi changes. So the value of phi will so adjust itself as that the ratio again remains constant, and therefore this ratio will again be M. So at the end of the day again you will have the same formula RP2 prime 1 plus M is equals to S prime. So therefore RP2 prime is now S prime divided by 1 plus M. So in other words, this, if S prime is 2% of S, S prime equals to 1.02 times S divided by 1 plus M, which means RP2 prime is basically 1.02 times RP2. Okay, and similarly you will have RP1 prime as 2% of the original pitch diameter. So using that you will be able to solve the problem which I have already done for you in the Excel sheet. So the module is given as 4 mm, the pressure angle is given as 20 degree, the pressure angle in radians is the pressure angle in degrees multiplied by pi divided by 180, which is 0.35 radians. Now as per the data, the number of teeth on the pinion is 19, the number of teeth on the wheel is 37, which means that for a module of 4 mm, the pitch circle diameter will be the number of teeth multiplied by module. Module is this entry, which is B2. So B2 times B8 is going to be the pitch circle diameter in the Excel sheet. So pitch circle diameter can be calculated now using this formula, module times number of teeth. So that turns out to be 76 and 148. Radius is half of the diameter, which is pretty easy to calculate. Now circular pitch will be pi times d by n, or pi times module, which is what we have calculated. Module is 4 mm and pi is given by this entry E4, which is 3.14, and therefore you will have this as your circular pitch. Please note that the circular pitch for both the pinion and the wheel is just the same. So the gear ratio, which is the number of teeth in the wheel divided by the number of teeth in the pinion, that comes out as 1.94 as per the formula. Center distance is the, as we have seen, is the sum of the two pitch circles, which is C10 and B10, and therefore you will have the center distance, that is the nominal center distance, to be B10 plus C10, comes out as 112 mm. Addendum is equals to module as per SI standard, so therefore the module being 4 mm, the addendum is 4 mm. Dedendum is 1.25 module as per the SI standards formulas, so therefore the dedendum is calculated to be 1.25 times 4, which is 5 mm, and therefore the whole depth, which is addendum plus dedendum, is 4 plus 5, which is 9, and the clearance, which is dedendum minus addendum, is 1 mm. And finally base circle is RB is equals to RP cos phi, and therefore you will have the base circle calculated to be 35.7 and 69.5 mm respectively. Now when the center distance increases by 2%, it is basically the pitch circle radius which increases accordingly by 2%. So here the modified pitch circle radius is calculated as 2% more than the nominal pitch circle diameter, pitch circle radius. So the nominal pitch circle radius was 38, it has been increased by 2%. I have simply multiplied it by 1.02 and this is the nominal pitch circle radius now. Similarly, pitch circle radius of the wheel has been calculated by multiplying with the nominal pitch circle radius of the wheel with 1.02 and you get 75.48. Now if you back calculate the pressure angle, you will see that is base circle remaining same, as we understood that the base circle radius has to remain same and the pitch circle radius will change to accommodate the change in shaft distance, and therefore again if you use the formula RB equals to RP cos phi, but this time using the modified pitch circle diameter, you will get to see that the pressure angle has changed. So pressure angle has now changed from 20 degree to 22 degree. So we get to see that there is about a 1% change in pressure angle for a 2% change in the shaft distance. So we should not mind that change in the nominal pressure angle, but the important point to note is that the gear ratio remains constant. So even if there is assembly related inaccuracies in your manufacturing processes, the good thing about involute gear, the way they are designed, is that these assembly related inaccuracies will not have any impact finally on the gear ratio. The gear ratio will still be the ratio of the two pitch circles, or better still the ratio of the two base circles, whichever way you look at it, it's going to be just the same. So the gear ratio remains unaffected. It is only the pitch circle radius which will change by some amount and the pressure angle which will change by some amount. So this is one of the advantages, as we talked in the last class, of involute gear. So involute gears can accommodate errors in assembly. So that is one very nice advantage which we elaborated in the last class. So with that we will now get into this other important aspect of involute gear tooth profiles. Involute tooth profiles are known to have interference related problems. So this is one of the disadvantages of involute gear tooth profiles. Let us see how it arises and what can be done to make sure that in a running setup this the design is in such a way that the interference can be avoided. We will recall that the involute tooth profile exists only in the radial for the radial region where the radius is more than the base circle. That is because involute extends only beyond the base circle by its very definition. Involute is the locus of a point on a taut string as it is unwound from a circle. So if the circle has the radius RB, then the involute curve can be defined only in the radial region which is having the value greater than RB. So that was one important parameter that we had noted. Now we will remember that as per the SI standards, the dedendum circle radius is given by the pitch circle radius minus 1.25 times the module, where the module is expressed in mm. Similarly, the geometric relation between base circle and pitch circle, which we derived in the last class, is RB equals to RP cos phi. So using these two relations, we can find out that for a pressure angle phi of 20 degree, there is a particular number of teeth after which we can get the condition that the dedendum circle is actually more than the base circle radius. Let me just quickly elaborate or sketchily prove this idea to you. So as we said, the dedendum circle RD is equals to RP minus 1.25 times module, and module we know is module we know is 2 times pitch circle radius, which is basically the pitch circle diameter, divided by the number of teeth. So this comes as RP minus 2.5 divided by N into RP, right? Whereas the base circle radius we know is Rp times cos phi, right? So the condition for Rd to be greater than Rb is the following: Rp minus 2.5 Rp divided by n has got to be greater than Rp times cos phi. But then at this stage we realize that there is no dependence on Rp at all. So this basically means 1 minus cos phi has got to be greater than 2.5 divided by n, which also means that this has to be greater, n has to be greater than 2.5 divided by 1 minus cos of 20 degree, and this approximately comes out as 41. Okay, when you do the calculation it will come out as 41. So therefore when your number of teeth is greater than 41, or just if it is since it is not going to be an integer, you have to play it safe and you say that when n is greater than 42, then you will have this condition that the tooth profile is such that the dedendum circle is more than the base circle, which means all through it is an involute because it ends above the base circle. So therefore it is a involute all through. But if the value of the number of teeth is less than 41, we see that the critical number is 41 point something. So the number of teeth has to be integer, either it has to be 41 or lesser, or it has to be 42 or greater. So if it is 42 or greater, then our mathematical analysis tells us that we are sure that the dedendum circle is more than the base circle, and therefore the involute tooth profile is complete. Whereas if that condition is not satisfied, if n is lesser than 41, then you can get into a situation where the dedendum circle is less than the base circle, which means the portion between the base circle and the dedendum circle is actually not an involute. It is simply a radial extension from the base circle. So therefore you cannot expect conjugate action between the gear tooths in engagement to be actually occurring in this portion of the gear. So therefore you will do well to avoid this condition where the engagement is happening in the portion which is not involute. But please note that it does not mean that if you have a gear tooth, a gear which has gear tooth lesser than 41, if the number of teeth on the gear is lesser than 41, that does not necessarily imply that you will land into this trouble associated with interference. For that we will hold on and will give you a better proof. What it simply means is that there is an alarm bell that the tooth profile is not an involute, and there is a chance that engagement might take place in the portion of the tooth which is not an involute. What exactly that condition is, we will come to it in a moment. So the engagement between the tooth we understand should be in the involute region for conjugate action, and if the engagement is not in this involute region, and you will now have this condition that it is possible that engagement is not in the involute region once your number of tooth falls below 41 for a pressure angle of 20 degree, then there will be a chance of interference, which is what we will study. So in this diagram what is shown are the two base circles in red line, the two pitch circles has been shown in blue, and the green circle associated with the wheel is the addendum circle of the wheel. The addendum circle of the pinion is not shown because that is inconsequential. So what we understood from the gear tooth geometry and the geometry of the engagement, which we talked about in the last class, that the point of contact has to move on the tangent, the internal tangent between the two base circles will be the point of contact between the two gear tooths will move on this line AB, the line AB being the internal tangent to the two base circles. So therefore what we are sure is that the point of contact between the two gear tooth as it is meshing will move along this line AB. What we want to make sure that the point of contact does not go and touch this point A. So to avoid interference, the addendum circle should not touch the base circle, because once it touches the base circle, you are hitting the critical condition. If it is touching beyond the base circle, then there is no problem. That is in the radial region where the radius is more than the base circle, it is definitely involute. Trouble will happen if you are if the addendum of this wheel just touches the base circle, and then the interference will start. But if the addendum circle is lesser, let's say imagine that there is another green dotted circle which is of lesser radius than the green circle that is shown, then there is absolutely no chance of any interference, because in that case the engagement will end wherever the green circle is cutting this line AB. But if the green circle is cutting the line exactly at the base circle as is shown in this drawing, then you are approaching the critical condition and you should avoid this condition. So this is what we will find. For interference at pinion to start, what we therefore note is that the addendum circle radius, which is O2A for the wheel, if that is the addendum circle radius and you have this green circle exactly touching the red circle at the point A, which also happens to be the point of tangency of this line AB. So if all of these meet, then you are going to have the critical condition where the interference will just start. So this, in other words, tells us that our addendum circle on the wheel should be lesser than this green circle. If it is lesser, then you don't have any fear of interference. If it is equal to or greater than, then obviously you should be concerned about the prospect of interference occurring between these two pairs of gear. So to analyze this problem, we take recourse to our trigonometric formulas. You will if you apply triangle law, which is the cosine law that you would have studied in high school physics, to this triangle O2PA. So O2PA, if you apply triangle law, then O2A square, which is this line O2A square, will be O2P square plus AP square plus 2 times O2P AP into sine phi. Actually it is cosine of pi by 2 plus phi, but cosine of pi by 2 plus phi comes with as sine minus sine of phi, and there was a minus sign in the cosine law, so therefore this is coming as sine phi. So this is just an application of the cosine rule within the triangle A2PA. Also from trigonometric consideration, AP, this line, is equals to O1P, which is this radial distance or the radius of the base circle, times sine phi, because the angle between O1P and O1A is exactly phi, because this angle is phi, which is the pressure angle. So the angle between the radius of the base circle at the condition of tangency and the radius of the pitch circle, they will form the same angle, which is the pressure angle. So now you will have this condition that AP is equals to O1P sine phi. Now if you do a little bit of manipulation and little bit of simplification, you will get to see that all that I have to do is I have to change AP to O1P sine phi and then relate O2P and O1P, which is done in this way. So this formula can now be obtained by simply substituting wherever I get to see AP, I will substitute a O1P sine phi, and then I will pull out O2P from the formula, divide it throughout by O2P, and this formula can be obtained. Now this formula, in other words, tells us that O2A minus O2P is given by this. Now what is O2A minus O2P? O2A is the addendum circle radius of the wheel and O2P is the pitch circle radius of the wheel. So therefore addendum circle radius minus pitch circle radius by definition is the addendum. So at the critical condition, what we have is that the addendum should be equal to this formula, whatever that is. So what we know again from standardization is that addendum has to be equals to module, which means module is 2 times pitch circle diameter, pitch circle diameter divided by number of tooth, and pitch circle diameter is 2 times pitch circle radius. O2P is the pitch circle radius, so module is 2 times O2P divided by N2. And when you do that and we take lambda for this ratio O1P by O2P, please note as per the drawing O1P is the pitch circle radius of the pinion and O2P is the pitch circle radius of the wheel. So therefore the ratio of O1P and O2P, which I am symbolizing as lambda, is lesser than 1. So this is a ratio which is lesser than 1, and similarly number of teeth in pinion is equals to lambda times number of teeth in wheel, because after all the ratio of the pitch circle radius is equal to the ratio of the number of tooth also, because they are having the same module, as we all know. So therefore if you make these substitutions here, that is O2A minus O2P, if you put it as 2 O2P by N2, then the O2P on both the sides must get cancelled, and therefore you will have this relation holding true. I think I will just redo this part of the proof in my notebook here. So what we have is O2A minus O2P is equals to O2P square root, let me just have a look at the formula, square root 1 plus lambda into lambda plus 2 into sine square phi minus 1, right. This is the formula that we derived, and we also know that the addendum must be 2 times O2P divided by N2, right. So therefore what we want is that the addendum should be lesser than this critical number O2A minus O2P, and when we do that we get 2 times O2P divided by N2 must be lesser than O2P into, I have forgotten a bracket here, square root of 1 plus lambda into lambda plus 2 sine square phi minus 1. So the O2P can get cancelled from both sides, and therefore you will have N2 to be greater than 2 by square root 1 plus lambda into lambda plus 2 sine square phi minus 1. Okay. We also know that N1 has to be equal to N2 times lambda, which means N1 has to be greater than 2 times lambda divided by square root 1 plus lambda into lambda plus 2 sine square phi minus 1. Okay. So these are the critical number of tooth which must be present in the pinion and in the wheel such that interference is avoided. Obviously wheel has more number of teeth than pinion, so if we check this condition for the pinion, we should be okay to check the interference condition. So therefore interference condition will be mainly given in terms of number of tooth on the pinion, and that condition, as we have worked out, comes out as 2 lambda divided by square root of 1 plus lambda into lambda plus 2 sine square phi minus 1. It's a bit longish formula, but you should not have much difficulty to go through the derivation and understand how this formula comes through. Okay, a very related phenomena of interference is undercutting. So interference, as we have seen, is the phenomena which happens between two meshing involute gears. If there are two meshing involute gears and if the number of teeth happen to be lesser than this critical number which you are seeing in your slide, then there is a chance that the engagement is not happening in the conjugate action is not happening, and it is not an involute to involute engagement, and therefore engagement is not perfect in terms of mechanical transmission. It is even worse in terms of wear and performance of the two engaging tooth. So it will be getting rapidly worn out, because after all the involute tooth profile does not exist, it is just a radial extension. So therefore the wearing action also is very drastic in case the interference does happen. Now if you now think about gear manufacturing processes, one common manufacturing process for spur gears is that of rack cutting. So in rack cutting, if you would have observed some of those YouTube videos which I mentioned in the previous class, you would know that in the rack cutting operation, essentially the rack is a cutter, which is also happening to be a straight tooth cutter, because it so happens for the involute gear geometry the rack tooth profile is straight. So when this rack is meshing with the circular blank, it will cut out the involute tooth profile on the circular blank, and as a result you will get your spur gears. Now if there is an interference between this straight tooth rack cutter and the spur gear, then obviously there will be material which will be scooped out during this manufacturing process. The interference that occurs between a spur gear and the rack cutter at the time of manufacturing itself will lead to undercut tooth profiles, because the wearing action is much more rapid when we are talking about the engagement between the rack cutter and the gear blank. So or the gear blank together with the gear geometry, I should say, gear tooth profile. So the material will be rapidly machined or worn out from this gear tooth, and as a result it will be weakened, and this phenomena is called undercutting. So let us go through this slide just once carefully. So undercutting happens when gears are manufactured using rack cutter. If there is interference between the rack cutter and the gear, then the gear material will be undercut. That simply means that there is the engagement conditions between the tooth profile of the rack and the tooth profile of the gear is not the correct ones. As a result, there will be rapid wear, if you may so call it, and that rapid wear is not because of two gears, that is rather wear between the cutter and the gear. So that phenomena we give it a special name which is called undercutting, and as a result of undercutting the gear tooth will be weakened and it may cause premature failure. So again the condition for undercutting may quickly be derived. You will recall a rack cutter being a straight can be assumed, the rack profile of the gear can be assumed if we think that this wheel diameter is going to infinity. So if the wheel you imagine is going to infinity, then that basically becomes a rack cutter. That is like saying that the straight line is a circle with radius of curvature infinity. So that is a concept that comes from geometry, that a straight line is a circle with radius as infinity. So as this wheel radius goes to infinity, we get into the situation where this wheel actually becomes a rack or a straight tooth gear. Then when it becomes a rack, then in that corresponding situation the lambda that we have designated, which is the radius of the pinion divided by the radius of the wheel. But now if the radius of the wheel is going to infinity, then this lambda will go to 0. So the situation that we have to understand for interference or undercutting, whatever, between the gear and the rack is that which is obtained from this formula itself, but with the special case that lambda equals to 0. So right in this formula, if we try to put lambda equals to 0, we should be able to get the condition of interference between a rack cutter and a gear and a spur gear, and that condition of interference is essentially known as undercutting, because this is a manufacturing process rather than the operational process between the gears. However, you see, if I put lambda to be 0 in the numerator and denominator, both we get zeros. So this is in the 0 by 0 form, but we have L'Hopital's rule. So we will take the limit of this quantity as lambda tends to rule to 0, and using all those formulas for limits, we can easily evaluate the limit of that ratio as lambda tends to 0. It comes out as 2 by sine square phi. So if the number of teeth in your gear is greater than 2 by sine square phi, then there will be no interference between the rack cutter and the gear during the manufacturing process, and as a result you need not be afraid of undercutting. So therefore, as designers you will typically like to use gears which will be involute in profile and which will have the number of teeth which is more than 2 by sine square phi. You would not like to use a gear which has less than this number. Again, if you put phi as 20 degree, this number comes out roughly as 18. So therefore, with 20 degree pressure angle, you should use gears with minimum 18 number of teeth. If you are not using it, then probably you should be concerned about interference and undercutting phenomena. Also, through this formula, it should be very clear to you that as we increase phi, sine square phi increases and therefore 2 by sine square phi decreases. So with larger pressure angle, this limit can be brought down. So if we really want to use gears with smaller gears with smaller number of tooth, then one way to do it is that we should increase the pressure angle. Increasing the pressure angle will lower this limit. N1 min can come down if the pressure angle is increased. So that way larger pressure angle is favored, but please remember recall the discussion that we had in the last session. Therein we understood that if pressure angle is large, then you can run into the trouble that there will be a large shaft deflection associated with a larger pressure angle. So you should not give too large pressure angle. Again, if you give too less pressure angle also, then you will have a problem associated with undercutting. So therefore, keeping all these balances, pressure angles of 20 degree is what is the SI standard, and therefore this is being used quite prevalently in industrial practice. Okay, the next topic is contact ratio. This is also something to do with the geometry. For want of time, I am not going to go to the details of these aspects of contact ratio, but I am simply going to elaborate what this ratio means. We understand that when the engagement of the gear tooth take place, that is what is shown in this drawing. The engagement takes place as is schematically shown in the drawing on your left. So here the start of engagement happens here, which is denoted by S. So at this point the engagement is starting, and at this point where I am holding my cursor now, at this point you get to see that there is end of engagement. Now typically what you want is that before one pair of tooth finishes its engagement, another pair of tooth should come into contact, because if the following pair of tooth doesn't come into engagement before the engagement is finished for this pair of tooth, then for some duration of time there is actually no positive drive between this two gear system. By positive drive, what I mean is that there has to be one part pushing the other part into motion. If that is not happening, then there is no positive drive. So at all instants of time we are expecting that at least one pair of tooth must be in contact so as to enable the condition of positive drive to be maintained at all instants of time. So here if we look into the finer details, we see that the start of engagement happens exactly at this instant where I am hovering my mouse button now. The end of engagement for the same tooth pair happens here, right? So if we exactly calculate the distance and the time and everything else for the start and the end of engagement, we have to make sure that before the end of engagement the next pair of tooth definitely comes into contact. So we can do a detailed analysis, and the analysis is not difficult, it is almost given in the slides, but again for want of time I am unable to derive these formulas right here, but the derivation as you see is given. But the significance of contact ratio is this, that if contact ratio is greater than 1, then you are sure that there is always at least one pair of teeth which is in contact, right. So if that is ascertained, then you know for sure that always positive drive conditions exist in your gear drive, in your gear transmission system, and therefore that is a good design. However, if it falls below 1, then it is a matter of concern, because it is not a positive drive, and most probably it will not be able to maintain the constant angular velocity ratio which is desirable in gears. So you have to check the contact ratio, in other words, from all these gear geometry parameters, and ensure that for continuous engagement you have contact ratio greater than 1. Usually the recommended value of contact ratio is 1.3 to 1.4, but there are high contact ratio gears also available, but those are beyond the scope of the present course. Present course is about usual gears in application. So for all those usual gears, the recommended values will be between 1.3 to 1.4. So this is the formula for contact ratio if you want. So this formula you should check when you are designing for gears, when you are using gears, when you are buying gears, that the for the gears that you are using, the contact ratio is greater than 1. Okay, with that I think we have come to the end of understanding the geometry between two gears in a gear mechanism. But now what is important is the idea of gear train. So very rarely we will be able to accomplish our objective just by using a gear pair. Sometimes when we need to transmit power and motion across larger distances, we will need to transmit it through lot of these gear pairs. And when you have a lot of these gear pairs, when you have multiple number of these gear pairs in action, that is called a gear train. So we will quickly study in this last hour different gear trains, and that is exactly what is being used in automobile applications also. So we will now turn our focus to gear trains. So gear pairs are used to transmit motion and power through smaller distances, but if you want to transmit motion and power through larger distances, a gear train is being used, and I will tell you how this is brought about and what are the advantages of using gear train as opposed to just a gear pair. Remember that it is not advisable to use large gears, because large gear means large mass. To make a large gear in motion, you will induce lots of energy losses. Smaller gears will have less losses. So instead of, if you have to transmit motion across larger distances, instead of using a very large gear, it is better to use multiple number of smaller gears, which is exactly the concept of gear train, as we will see. So larger gear is supposed to be avoided because they induce losses, energy losses, and the transmission efficiency comes down. Instead, multiple smaller gears will not compromise on the efficiency, but yet it will bring about the desired effect of transmitting across larger distances. So larger number of gears forming larger gear train will induce energy loss due to the same principle, that if you have a gear train with large number of gears, again you will have large energy losses, because the final idea is this: if you include more mass in your system, you will include more losses. So we will rarely try to transmit motion across large distance using a gear train. Hydraulic is a better idea when you try to transmit power across larger distances, but gears are used to transmit motion and power through smaller distances. Even if it is a gear train, you should not use a gear train which is very long and contain a large number of gears, because large number of even the small gears, but since the number of gears is more, the added mass is more, and that will induce losses. So as we all would have seen in a typical automotive garage, if you have had a chance to see the gearbox is essentially a gear train. So a gearbox is essentially a multiple gear train arrangement to enable a range of torque speed characteristics. Remember, this is where it all started, because we know due to the driving conditions we need different torque speed combinations, and in a gearbox we have different gear arrangement, and when you shift the gears you essentially ensure that a certain gear ratio is being maintained. So gear box essentially contains lot of gears for the choice of the driver. For the choice of the driver, when he engages one gear or the other, he gets a different torque speed combination for his own driving habits and for his own driving requirements. So this is what we will see in more details as we come to the automotive gearbox in a moment's time. But before getting to that, let us look at a simple gear train. This is what a simple gear train means. On each shaft there is just one gear, and let's say we had to transmit motion from this shaft to that shaft. I'll just redraw it once more in my tablet. So let's say the objective is to transmit motion between this shaft to that shaft. So there are two ways in which we could do it. We could either go for just a gear pair arrangement of this kind, or we could, for the same distance, we could try to put multiple gears in this form, right? So this will also transmit motion. This is called a simple gear train. So this is what is called a simple gear train, and as it should be clear from the drawing itself, the added mass, the mass of the gears itself, will be much lesser in a gear train arrangement as compared to a gear pair for the same shaft distance, that is. So here if you have this as capital M1, this is capital M2, the total mass is capital M1 plus capital M2, whereas here, even though there are 4 gears, M1, M2, M3, M4, since all are smaller, M1 plus M2 plus M3 plus M4 will turn out to be lesser than capital M1 plus capital M2. So added mass being smaller, you essentially gain in terms of energy efficiencies of your system. So this is the principal reason for using gear trains as opposed to a gear pair, and we will now see exactly how to do the analysis for these gear train arrangements as we have shown. So the first idea to note is that since all of these gear pairs have to be in engagement, all of them must have the same module. We understood even from the perspective of a gear pair, both the gears in a gear pair should have the same module. If it is a gear train, all these individual gears will have to be in mesh, so therefore the module of the gears have got to be identical. This will be true even for compound gear and other more complicated gears. So without further emphasizing, we will assume that whenever we see a gear train, module of all gears in the gear train are identical. Sometimes it is not a very strict requirement in terms of mathematics or the physics of the problem, but it is mostly ensured in terms of the practical simplicity. I would say that you do not like to mix up the different modules, so better use same modules for all the gears that are there in your gear train. So this will be the overwhelming assumption all through, that we will use module of the gear to be same for all the gears in the gear train. So now if we look at the transmission law between the first two, that is the blue and the red, it is clear omega 1 R1 should be equals to omega 2 R2. But in the analysis of gear train as opposed to gears, we will keep track of the direction also of the motion. While doing gear pair analysis, we did not keep track strictly of the direction of motion because there were just 2 gears and we could intuitively find out the direction of rotation, but it will get increasingly complicated if we try to rely on our intuition for gear train analysis. So therefore we will keep track of the direction of rotation by including a negative sign. So whenever we have an external gearing, we understand that the direction of motion of the output is reversed as compared to the direction of motion of the input. So therefore we will have the rule omega 1 R1 should be equals to minus omega 2 R2. But again omega 2 R2 should be equals to minus omega 3 R3. So therefore omega 1 R1 should be equals to minus omega 2 R2 should be equals to omega 3 R3. So therefore if you now consider 1 to be the input and 3 to be the output, so finally you have omega 1 R1 is equals to omega 3 R3. So basically it is the size of the blue and the green gears which mattered. The size of the red gear actually does not come into effect at all, but yet it is brought in, it is called an idler. The idler serves one purpose, as opposed to simply meshing the blue and green gear together. in which case the green gear would have got the direction of motion opposite to the direction of motion of the blue gear. One effect of this red gear is to induce a reversal of that direction of motion. So therefore this is called idler gear, or a gear which causes simply reversal of motion. It does not change the transmission ratio. The transmission ratio between the input and the output is again given by omega 1 R1 is equals to omega 3 R3. The idler has got no purpose in determining the transmission ratio. Similarly, for the drawing that I have drawn here, so here again you will find omega 1 R1 is equals to minus omega 2 R2, and that will be equals to that will be equals to plus omega 3 R3, because between 2 and 3 there will be again a sign reversal, and that will be equals to minus omega 4 R4, right. So omega 1 R1 is minus omega 4 R4, right. Now please note, you could have selected a capital R1 and a capital R4 such that you could have selected capital R1 plus R4, which is equals to R1 plus R2 plus R3 plus R4, and R1 by R4 to be same as small r1 by small r4. In which case, as far as the kinematics is concerned, or as far as the idealized kinematics is concerned, you would have got the same transmission between the both. The gear pair as well as the gear train would have been identical. But in practice, what will happen is that the picture on the top, that of a gear pair, being a bulky arrangement, being a massy arrangement, will incur a lot of energy losses, and therefore that should be avoided, and the better idea is to use a simple gear train arrangement, because the mass is lesser. Mass being lesser is a very important criteria for the selection of the transmission. Just like we have seen that external gearing, we were predominantly concerned about external gearing, but you can understand that identically you could think about internal gearing, though we did not talk about it, but it is just the same idea. So if you have one gear and if you have a smaller gear rolling on in the inside of it, then you have an internal gearing arrangement. So here again, if you include the no slip condition and everything else, then you will get to see that omega 1 R1 should be equals to omega 2 R2, right. Because I have not used the negative sign here, because the direction of motion between the two gears is same. So when you have internal gearing arrangement, it is just exactly the same except for the minus sign. So for internal gearing, the direction of velocity is not changed, the direction of velocity is just the same, and therefore we will not include any negative sign associated with it. Okay, so now we come to what is known as compound gear train. So in compound gear train, what we see is that the intermediate shaft, as opposed to simple gear train here, where the intermediate shaft had just one gear, right. In a compound gear train, we will see the intermediate shaft, the red, the one that is carrying the red gears here, has two gears. So here what we see, the input shaft is carrying gear 1, the intermediate shaft is carrying two gears, gear 2 and gear 3, and then the gear 3 is meshing with gear 4, which is mounted on the output shaft. So the signature of a compound gear train arrangement is the following, that it has one shaft, one intermediate shaft, which has got more than one gear. So as is shown in this drawing, the intermediate shaft carries two red gears, therefore it is a compound gear train arrangement. So how do we do analysis for this gears? Firstly, again to emphasize that all gears in this gear train is identical in its module. It is required that gear 1 and gear 2 be identical in module. It is required that gear 3 and gear 4 be identical in module because of the condition of engagement between gear pairs. Actually, it is not required, strictly speaking, it is not required that gear 2 and gear 3 be of the same module. That is not a requirement, but we still impose that requirement mainly to ensure interchangeability of gears and to make things simpler. Otherwise, you could, technically speaking, have situations where gear 2 and gear 3 runs on different modules, but that is typically not the industrial practice. To keep matters simple, we would like to choose all the modules of the gear to be within this gear train to be identical. So such choice will be always implied. So if we apply for the analysis of this sort of a gear train, what we need to do is the following. We apply the law of gearing for each gear pair. Suppose we have, what we see in this picture is that we have two gear pairs, 1 and 2 is, there is a gear pair between the gears 1 and 2, there is a gear pair between gear 3 and 4. So between the gear 1 and 2 we have the relation omega 1 r1 equals to minus omega 2 r2. So we do account for the change in direction of velocity due to external gearing, and if there is internal gearing there is no change. So the minus sign will be there only if there is an external gear. And now we also realize that omega 3 r3 must be equals to omega 4 r4 because they are also meshing. So omega 3 r3 must be equals to minus omega 4 r4 for the same reason that this is a gear pair as was the gear pair between 1 and 2. But now 2 and 3 are mounted on the same shaft, which means omega 2 must be equal to omega 3. So using this logic, if we know what is omega 1, we can calculate what is omega 2. Then omega 2 is same as omega 3. So omega 3 will be calculated, and again using this part of the formula we can find out what is omega 4. So omega 3 r3 being equals to minus omega 4 r4 enables us to calculate what is omega 4, which is the final output speed. So that is compound gear train. The arrangement that you see in a typical transmission box, such as in a lathe or even some of the cars, there you will see what is known as a reverted compound gear train. So it is a compound gear train, but it is also reverted. So what that means is that the input and the output shaft are actually pointing along the same direction. If you see here, the input and the output shaft are not they are parallel, but they are not concentric, they are not identical. The directions are shifted. It is parallel, but they are shifted. Whereas if you look at the input and output shaft in this arrangement, it is coaxial, or so as to say that both are along the same, have the same center line. Both the input shaft and the output shaft have the same center line. So in this case we call this as a reverted compound gear train. Please note that this shaft, the blue shaft that you can see, carries two gears. That's why the gear 2 and gear 3 as is marked. That's why it is a compound gear train, but it is also reverted because the input and the output shaft is concentric. So again the analysis will proceed assuming that the module of all gears are identical. Please note 1 and 2 have to be identical for the kinematic requirement, 3 and 4 have to be identical for the kinematic requirement. It is not necessary as far as kinematics is concerned to have identical module for 2 and 3. It is just assumed for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of practical ease in implementation. So we will take this into implicitly that the module of all gears are identical. So if the modules are identical, this is how the analysis is simplified. We know that the radius of the of this red gear plus the radius of the blue gear, which is shown in 2. So R1 plus R2 must be equals to R3 plus R4. R4 is the radius of this magenta gear, R3 is the gear which is mounted on this blue shaft and which is denoted here. So geometrically it is very clear that R1 plus R2 has to be equals to R3 plus R4. But now since the modules of all these gears 1, 2, 3 and 4 are all identical, therefore what we have is, and we know that module is finally diameter divided by with circle diameter divided by the number of teeth, and if the modules is identical, then this ratio is going to tell us that the number of teeth, capital N denotes the number of teeth, the number of teeth in gear 1 plus number of teeth in gear 2 is equals to number of teeth in gear 3 plus number of teeth in gear 4. So this relation is coming out because the modules of all gears have been chosen to be identical. So this is what I said when I meant that there are some advantages in terms of simplicity of the formulas that we will use, and the analysis becomes simpler if the module of all gears are chosen identical. So this is where we see. So if we know the number of teeth in 3 of these gears, the number of teeth in the 4th one can be very easily determined, and there exists such a nice compact relationship between the number of teeth in all these 4 gears. N1 plus N2 is equals to N3 plus N4. Okay. Now what is the overall gear ratio? Again, the gear ratio between 2 to 1 is proportionate to the ratio of the diameters between 2 to 1. The diameter ratio is same as the teeth ratio, which is N2 by N1, because the module is same. Again, between 3 and 4, similar analysis tells us that the gear ratio between 3 and 4 is N4 by N3. So between 1 and 2 you encounter a gear ratio, between 3 and 4 you encounter another gear ratio. So therefore the total gear ratio is the product of these 2 gear ratios. N2 by N1 is the first gear ratio that you encountered, N4 by N3 is the second one. Therefore the total gear ratio is just a multiplication of all this. So omega, in other words, omega 4 by omega 1 is going to be N4 into N2 divided by N3 into N1. But then while designing for gears or gearboxes rather, one has to make sure that the gearbox fits in the least amount of space. So from space constraint size, that you want to keep the gearbox size minimum. So from that particular aspect, what we get to see is that N2 by N1 and N4 by N3 is got to be same, and therefore each of these gears will gear ratios will be exactly the same, and the product of it has to be G. So therefore each of them has to be square root of G. So it is an easy exercise to prove this from first principles, but I think the better idea is you can just iterate with different gear ratios and see that if you have to get the condition of minimum size, then you will see that if you choose the gear ratios to be equal between 2 and 1 and between 4 and 3, you in fact turn up with this condition, that is square root G. I am not giving you the proof of this condition, but you can do that as an exercise. So this is the condition that usually a gear designer or a transmission designer will satisfy. He or she will induce this condition that the gear ratios between 2 and 1 should be same as gear ratio between 4 and 3, which gives the condition that the individual gear ratios must be the square root of the overall gear ratio. But you must understand that once you have the square root condition, there is one problem. Suppose the gear ratio you are asking for is 7, but square root 7 is not a rational number, it is an irrational number, whereas N2 and N1 are both integers. So there is no choice of N2 and N1 which will exactly give you square root of 7, right? There is, you are not, no integers N1 and N2 will give you square root 7. So as a result you will not be able to exactly attain the gear ratio, but you will be able to attain this gear ratio at least in an approximate sense, which is all that is necessary in engineering applications. So we will see a quick example about this. So let us try to design a gearbox to transmit a gear ratio of 7. So it turns out that we are looking therefore for N2 by N1 and N4 by N3 to be square root 7, which comes out approximately as 2.65, right. So if you want this condition to be satisfied, let us take, and we are always careful that we want to design a gearbox with minimum size, which in other words means everything, the radiuses and the number of teeth, everything should be at its minimum. But then the minimum number of teeth which we must choose to avoid interference is 18 for a 20-degree pressure angle, as we have calculated few minutes back. So the minimum number of teeth that we have to choose, N1, is 18. So that gives us N2, which is 2.65 times 18, that comes out as 47.62. But you cannot have a gear with 47.62 number of teeth, you would rather have a gear with 48 teeth, right. Similarly, now what we have is N3 plus N4 should be equal to N2 plus N1, but then N3 by N4, N4 by N3, I am sorry, N4 by N3 has been already calculated as 2.65. So if you substitute N4 as 2.65 times N3, then what you get is N3 plus N4 is 3.65 times N3. So 3.65 N3 should be equal to N2 plus N1, which we have already calculated, 18 plus 48, which is 66, right. So in other words, 3.65 N3 should be 66. That gives us 66 as N3 as 66 divided by 3.65, which is 18.1, and I can choose this approximately to be 18. Choosing this to be 18 gives me N4 again as 2.65 into 18, which again I will make it as 48. So therefore my choices are N1 is 18, N2 is 48, N3 is also 18, and N4 is also 48. But look now, the actual gear ratio that I will obtain is therefore 48 by 18 in the first pair, 48 by 18 also in the second pair. So the total gear ratio is 48 by 18 whole square, which is coming out as 7.11. So instead of being able to transmit a gear ratio of 7, I am able to transmit a gear ratio of 7.11 as per this design. So therefore I have not got the exact gear ratio that I have wanted, but I am quite sure that this design is going to be having the minimum size with the approximate condition of gear ratio, with the condition of gear ratio being approximately satisfied. So this is about gearbox design. Let me illustrate quickly to you how this is actually used in an automotive gearbox. So here what you get to see is I have taken this from a website called How Stuff Works. So I really advise you to go to this website, and there are lots of other interesting animations and pictures which really show how different mechanical components work. So here is how our usual manual transmission works, I should say. So the green shaft and the green gear mounted on the green shaft are the input side of the transmission. The green shaft basically goes to the engine side, and that is what we call as the input shaft, because the power is coming from the engine. There is another shaft here which is shown in red, which carries multiple number of gears. This shaft is called the lay shaft. Okay, so this is a typical reverted gear train arrangement in which the input and the output is this one, the yellow shaft, is coaxial or it is having the same, the shaft centers are basically superimposed. There is a lay shaft which carries multiple number of gears, and each of these gears are actually meshing with blue gears that is shown to be mounted on this output shaft. Actually these blue gears are running freely on the output shaft. The blue gears are actually not connected, though it may appear so in this drawing. If you carefully look at the animation in their website, you will find that the blue gears are not mounted on the output shaft. They are simply running free onto the shaft. So when in this condition, what we are seeing now, this is basically the neutral position of the gearbox. So now what we are seeing is that the engine is delivering its power and motion. So therefore the green shaft is moving one way or the other. The power is getting transmitted to the lay shaft. So the lay shaft is moving at a certain RPM. Because each of the gears is in mesh, each of these red gears is ensuring motion of these blue gears, but the blue gears are not connected to the output shaft in the drawing that is shown. So the output shaft does not have any motion. So basically in this neutral arrangement, the output shaft is idle. There is no motion in the output shaft, which is something which you would have also observed in neutral. The car or the bike does not move unless because of its inertia. Okay, so this is exactly what happens in the neutral position. Now when we are selecting the gears, either through the gear selector mechanism by hand or by feet in case of bike, what is happening is that there is a dog clutch which is moving along this output shaft. When the dog clutch engages with one of these gears, the way the gear shift mechanism is there, only one of these dog clutches, which are shown in magenta over here, can engage with only one of the blue gears. Once the dog clutch is engaged, then you sort of complete the circuit between the blue gear and the yellow output shaft. So whichever dog clutch engages with the blue gear, the motion of that blue gear will be transmitted through the dog clutch into the output shaft. So therefore you will have the motion transmission. Let's say if you have the dog clutch getting engaged to gear 1, then what you will see is that the motion transmission is happening through gear 1. So whatever is the speed of gear 1, that speed will be conveyed to the output shaft. The other gears will move, but these gears, in fact the other blue gears are actually moving at different speed, but the movement of the other gears at different speed is not going to cause any problem, because those gears are not connected to the output shaft. That's why it is very important to, when you are shifting the gears, you have to come through the neutral. So when you are going from gear 1 to gear 2, let's say, then you have to pass through this neutral, where you in the interim period you will have the dog clutch which is not making connection to any of the gears, and the output shaft has got no positive drive in it. If at all it is moving because of its inertia, nothing else. Then again it will engage, the dog clutch will engage with gear 2 and the transmission will take place. So if you note that what happens when the clutching is occurring at gear 1, in gear 1 you will see the engagement between the red and the blue gear is such that the gear ratio is maximum. So it is a small red gear which is engaging with the large blue gear. So that essentially means that the speed is of the output shaft is going to come down heavily, but if the speed comes down, the torque goes up, because the power has to remain constant. So when this gear 1 is getting engaged, essentially your speed is coming down, but your torque is going up. And again you will recall that when you have to drive your car or your bike in an upslope, you should rather be at gear 1 rather than at gear 5. In gear 5, if you see, it is the opposite condition. More or less the red and the blue gears are of equal size. So here there is absolutely no decrease in speed, accordingly there is no increase in torque, right? So if you don't want torque, if you want speed, then you should ensure that the dog clutch engages with the 5th gear, and you will get your output at a very high speed, but you will not be able to drive through an upslope, or you will not be able to overcome the resistance if the resistance is more. Whereas if the resistance is high, then you should use gear 1, in which case you will have a higher torque, but you will have lesser speed. So thereby we see that our original problem in a vehicle was that we want diverse conditions of torque speed as dependent on the driving condition, as dependent on the driving habits. So using this gearbox arrangement with 5 or 6 gears, we are able to get that condition. Depending upon which gear is getting engaged to the output shaft, you are able to attain any combination of the torque speed that you want. Also please note that there is a small little idler gear that you see here in the last arrangement. So this idler gear basically serves the purpose of reversing the motion. As you have seen in a simple gear train, if you have an intermediate gear, that intermediate gear simply serves the purpose of reversing the motion. So the red gear and the blue gear are again of the same size, but they are not in direct mesh, rather they are meshing through the idler gear, which means the red gear and the blue gear in this engagement, in the condition of reverse gearing, only in that condition you will get the output shaft and the lay shaft to be running in the same direction. For all other gear engagements, you will get the red shaft and the output shaft to be having oppositely directed motions. So the purpose of the idler gear is only to change the direction of motion of the output shaft, and that is how you can get a reversible motion in your output shaft, which essentially feeds to your wheels. So this is exactly how a manual transmission works, but automatic transmission is little more difficult, and automatic transmission relies on what is called the planetary gear train. We will do planetary gear train in a moment's time, but maybe it is a good time now to take a pause and invite questions from your side. If you have, there is only one topic that is remaining, which we will do in the next half an hour or so, which is about planetary gear trends. So other than that, if you have any questions, feel free to post them. We should be able to answer it for you. APIIT HR is asking, can we avoid interference by modifying the center distance between the shaft? By modifying the center distance with the shaft, what you have seen is that you are essentially modifying the pressure angle, right? The example that we have shown, when you are modifying the center distance, you are essentially modifying the pressure angle. And the minimum tooth requirement, that formula that we have just derived, that has a pressure angle dependence in the denominator, lambda divided by lambda into lambda plus 2 sine square phi. So that sine square phi term will change if the shaft distance is changed. So therefore the minimum tooth or minimum tooth required to avoid interference, that minimum tooth criteria will change if your shaft distance changes, because the pressure angle will change accordingly. So you are right that the pressure angle can be, the shaft distance can be used to change the pressure angle and thereby change the interference condition. I hope that answers your question. CTUR is asking, is there any other method to avoid interference? The interference that we have derived and we have understood is from first principles. The interference condition is exactly what we derived in the slide there. So anything which affects any part of that formula should be used to avoid interference. Just like we had the suggestion from APIIT HR that instead of directly changing the pressure angle, or let us say the ratio lambda, you can indirectly bring about the change by changing a parameter such as changing the shaft distance. So anything which changes lambda or phi will have its effect on interference. So if you can bring about direct or an indirect change in these two parameters, and if you can ensure that the number of teeth is more than what is predicted by that formula, then interference will be avoided. I hope that answers your question. Gear ratio is basically the torque ratio. Speed ratio is the inverse of the gear ratio. Gear ratio will be the diameter of the larger of the wheel divided by the diameter of the pinion, but sometimes it is sort of messed around this terminology. Gear ratio is mostly the torque ratio. Speed ratio is the ratio of the angular speeds in the output and the input shaft. So therefore they have a reciprocal relationship. I hope that answers your question. IGCPG is asking, which type of gear is preferred in automobiles? Spar gears obviously do a good job for cheaper cars, but spar gears will have a problem in terms of noise and vibration. Better therefore is helical gears. So if you have high end cars which are supposed to be very robust and yet has a good vehicle comfort and less acoustic emissions, then probably they have helical gears. But spar gears and helical gears are there. Planetary gears are also there if it's automatic transmission. So there are different types of gears in a car. You can't say that only spar gears are there, you can't say only helical gears are there. Each car will have its own components, but generally speaking helical gears will have better dynamic performance compared to spar gears. Spar gears will be cheaper, easier to manufacture, helical gears will be more costly to manufacture. Okay, I hope that answers your question. ICPGB is asking, how can we avoid interference? We can avoid interference by ensuring the number of teeth is more than what that formula gives you. We have calculated the formula for the minimum number of the teeth to avoid interference. If you ensure that you are using a gear which has teeth which is more than what is given by that formula, interference should not be of concern. The formula itself can be manipulated by changing the values of phi and lambda, and therefore using that formula you should be able to address your concerns about interference. I hope that answers the question. ICPGB is asking, what is the effect of increasing pressure angle? One effect that I have talked about is that it brings down the interference condition. We have seen that the undercutting condition rather is given by 2 by sine square phi, the minimum number of tooth that must be present in order to have the minimum number of tooth which must be present in order to prevent undercutting is 2 by sine square phi. So if you have a larger value of phi, larger pressure angle, then you can have this limit to be more relaxed. On the other hand, when your pressure angle is large, then a part of the force which is transmitted between the gear tooth will actually have a component towards the shaft, towards the radial direction of the gear, and it will directly go and hit the shaft, causing shaft deflection, which is definitely detrimental to the performance of your transmission. So these two are the major effects of pressure angles. How is the gear trains in modern automobiles? Well, different automobile manufacturer will obviously have different gearboxes and different systems. We cannot talk about all such gears, all such gearboxes. What I have shown to you right now is a typical one, and I hope you take that to be the starting point, and you can now explore different automobiles which are having different manual transmission. The high-end cars usually will have automatic transmission. It's only possibly in India where manual transmission cars have got a high volume of sales. In Western countries, it is the automatic transmission which has got a high volume of sales. So spur gears and the arrangement that I have shown is only true for manual gears, not for automatic transmission. Okay, how is the gear train? We have done this. Is undercutting a method to avoid interference? No. CTR is asking, is undercutting a method to avoid interference? No. Undercutting does not avoid interference. Interference happens when there are two gears in engagement, when there are two circular gears in engagement, and the engagement happens in the portion which is not involute. That is called interference, whereas undercutting happens when you have interference between a rack cutter and the gear itself. Okay, so undercutting is not a method to avoid interference. Okay, reverted gear train examples. The example of the automotive gear train that we have just talked of is a reverted gear train, because as you have seen, in an automotive gear train there is a lay shaft. The input and the output are concentric or coaxial, but added with the input and the output shaft, there is also a lay shaft which carries other gears. Therefore, that is a reverted compound gear train arrangement. So the automotive gearbox arrangement, or even in the lathes, the gearbox that you see is an example of reverted compound gear train arrangement. Okay, okay. So BEC is asking, would you show the animation of gearbox shifting to different speeds to output shaft? I don't have time to show you animations here in this, but I have given you the link. Please go to the animation is available in YouTube site. It is also available in the website How Stuff Works. Please go and see those animations for yourself. That will be an eye opener for you to understand how this transmission is working. DGR is asking, is undercutting applicable only for rack and pinion? Rack and pinion is one way in which undercutting can take place when the gear manufacturing process is through a rack cutter. Similarly, there can be other gear manufacturing process where basically there is a spur gear which is basically meshing with another circular blank. So the other spur gear is the cutter. So again, whenever you have interference between a cutter and the gear blank, then you have undercutting, right? So there are different gear manufacturing operations, which one of them which I have talked is about rack cutting operation. So similarly, if there is actually a spur gear cutter which cuts out the similar to a rack cutter, a spur gear cutters are available. In case you have interference between a spur gear cutter and the actual spur gear which you are making, in that case that interference will lead to undercutting. Okay, so that is answered. Is it possible to input power from two sources in one single differential gear? Yes, it is possible to have two input and one output. This is exactly what is done in planetary gear arrangements, which we will talk. It is also possible to have differential, as APIIT HR has mentioned differential gear as being one example of it, but in a differential gear what happens is that there is one input and two outputs. So the left and right wheel get two different outputs from the same input. That is how a differential gear works. But in general, for the concept of planetary gear, in planetary gear you have this arrangement wherein two inputs can give a single output, which is what we will see when we talk about planetary gears in the next part of this talk. BEC is asking, do I cover gear force analysis? No, we are not doing gear force analysis, we are only doing gear kinematics here. If you want, you can read books on gear force analysis or gear dynamics more particularly. I guess gear dynamics is even as per GATE syllabus, I think gear dynamics, if I am not wrong, is not there as a part of the GATE syllabus, but I may be wrong. Usually, at least in the IIT syllabus, what is covered is the gear kinematics, and I have restricted myself to the gear kinematics, not the gear dynamics. Okay, so that finishes all the question that I have here. Okay, DGI is asking, while designing gears, what should be kept in mind? I think while designing gears, everything that I have talked till now should be kept in mind. Even there are other things which I have not talked, they should also be understood and kept in mind. So I cannot repeat the entire course for you at this point, saying what should be kept in mind. All the parameters that we have discussed, contact ratio, interference, everything should be kept in mind. Module, all of it should be kept in mind. Okay, so planetary or epicyclic gear train, as it is called, is the following arrangement. Till now we were looking at gears which were fixed onto shafts, and the shafts themselves were not moving. The shafts were only rotating about a fixed axis. But now in a planetary gear train, what we will see is that the gears will be mounted on some carriers which were itself rotating about some axis. So as an example for this drawing that I have shown here, you have this red gear which is called the sun gear, and at the same center as the gear center of the sun gear, you have this green arm or the carrier mounted. So the carrier is pivoted exactly at the center of the sun gear, and the carrier can basically rotate because it is pivoted about the same gear center, it can rotate, and the carrier or the arm also carries at its other end a planet gear. So the planet gear can execute rotational motion with respect to the carrier. The carrier itself can rotate with respect to the frame, and the sun can rotate with respect to the frame. So this is the kinematics, that the sun rotates with respect to the frame, the arm rotates with respect to the frame, the planet rotates with respect to the arm. Till now we considered gears which were only rotating with respect to the frame, but now we will consider an example such as this planet gear, which is rotating with respect to the arm, which is itself rotating with respect to the frame, right. So this is why it is called a planetary gear arrangement, because if you carefully visualize this motion, what happens is that as the arm is rotating, it will carry the planet in one complete revolution across the sun, but then the planet also rotates about the arm. So as the planet is revolving around the sun, it is also rotating about its own axis. So this is similar to our solar system, and that is why this gear train is called a planetary gear train. If you know the geometry of epicycloids, then you will understand that each point in this planet is basically tracing out an epicycle, and therefore this is also called an epicyclic gear train. So the crucial point to understand is that the planet gear is mounted on a moving arm. It is not a stationary arm, it is a moving or a rotating arm, and this arm will usually rotate about the center of the sun gear. So therefore the total motion, we will now recall the essential principles of relative velocity. The total motion of the object would be the motion due to fixed arm plus motion due to arm. So let us consider this planet. If I am standing on the planet, then I will observe a certain motion, if I am standing on the arm, then I will observe a certain motion of the planet, but the motion as observed by the observer fixed on the inertial frame of the earth will observe the motion of the observer fixed to the arm plus the motion of the arm itself. So relative motion is basically the motion of the planet relative to the arm plus the arm motion will be the total motion as observed by the inertial observer. So this being true, what we know for sure, that motion which is due to fixed arm, that is motion which is relative to an observer who is seated on the arm, that is what we have already understood, that if the arm is fixed, then this is just a simple gear train, we know everything about its analysis. So motion due to the fixed arm should be quite trivial at this stage, that is just a simple gear train. So the total motion of any object here is the motion due to the fixed arising because of the arm being fixed. So we will consider two separate cases, one in which arm is fixed and the other in which everything else is mounted onto the arm and it is executing identical motion as the arm. So therefore, if you can add up these two motions, the total motion will be exactly the summation of these two motions. So we will divide and rule. The division of our work is as follows. We will first analyze the situation that what happens if this arm is considered to be fixed. If the arm is considered to be fixed, we will do the analysis and find out all the motions. In the next step, we will say what happens when everything is just locked with the arm and everything has identical motion, every object has identical motion with that of the arm. So as per relative velocity formula, the total motion will be the superposition of these two motions, and therefore if we add up these motions, we will get the total motion as observed by someone who is standing on the frame, right. So that is what we finally want, and this is our analysis methodology as we will show. We will also take a convention of clockwise rotation being positive. This is just our convention. Before going into the analysis, I will just like to make a small note. Different books will have different ways for analysis of planetary gear train systems. There are different methods, all of them are right, but I will advise you, please follow one method. The one that I am following is actually pretty simple. It is almost mechanical. You can do it in a very step by step fashion. This is called the tabular method. So the chances of making mistakes are minimal in this method. Don't confuse yourself by learning too many methods at the same time, especially when you are at the beginning stages of your learning. Learn one method. If you are comfortable with this method, please gain proficiency in this method and use it at least till you are proficient with this method, right. Don't confuse yourself by learning too many methods and gulping them down in your early stages of learning, because there is a risk that you will take some part of one method and some part of the other method and not only confuse yourself but will always be paranoid in this sort of analysis. Okay, so this is my word of good advice for you. Please learn one method. When you are learning the method, gain proficiency. If you are really confident about the usage of this method, then go and learn the other methods, and in fact you should be able to compare that all other methods are giving the same result. So what I am proposing is what is called the tabular method. So in this tabular method, things turns out to be pretty simple, and that is what I wish to show to you. So let us try and analyze this simple planetary gear train, after which we will do a more complicated one also. So here, as I said, there are two conditions that we wish to analyze. One condition in which the arm is fixed and the other condition in which everything else is locked to the arm or fixed to the arm. So accordingly, you have two rows. In the first row, I am analyzing the motion condition when the arm is fixed to the frame. It is not moving, it is immobile. So if the arm is fixed, then obviously the arm motion is 0. And let us say the sun motion is denoted as omega s. So if the arm is fixed and the sun motion is omega s, it is trivial to find out what is the planet motion. The planet motion is minus rs by rp. The planet motion, the planet motion is minus rs by rp into omega s. Remember, this minus sign is coming because it is an external gearing, and external gearing induces a direction change in the direction of motion, and rs by rp is exactly the speed ratio, if you may so call it, and that multiplied by omega s. So we know what is the motion of each of these links when the arm is fixed. In the next case, what we wish to do is what happens when every component is fixed to the arm. When every component is fixed to the arm, it has identical motion as the arm itself. So arm has a motion of omega a, let's say. Then you will have sun also to be moving at omega a, planet also is moving to be omega a, because you may get confused with this line thinking that how is it possible that everything is moving at same speed. This is a hypothetical condition that everything is fixed to the arm. If everything is fixed to the arm, everything will have the same speed. But this comes from the relative velocity idea that the total motion is motion due to the fixed arm plus motion of the arm itself. So in the first line we have considered motion due to the fixed arm, and in the second line we are considering everything else is fixed to the arm. So therefore the total motion is a simple summation of all these. So if we add each columns, we get the total motion of the arm to be omega a, we get the total motion of the sun to be omega s plus omega a, and to the planet as minus rs by rp omega s plus omega a. So this is the total motion. So now we can see that there are three variables, omega s, omega a, and omega p. So therefore if you know any two of them, if you know the motion of either arm or sun, then you know what is omega a, and you also know what is omega a plus omega s. If you know what is omega a plus omega s and you also know what is omega a, then nothing stops you to find omega s. And if omega s is known and omega a is known, then you should be able to calculate this planet motion also by substituting the values of omega s and omega a. So essentially what we see now is that this planetary gear train is actually a 2 degree of freedom system, which means that you need two inputs to be specified to get a fixed output. So if for example arm and sun motion is known, then we get to see the planet motion whatever it is, right. So this is a 2 degree of freedom system as opposed to a 1 degree of freedom system which we have done for simple spar gears. But here being a planetary gear, there are two inputs which decides the output, right. So from two inputs we get an output. The other way also we can think about it that one input gives two output, but let us not get into that part in this fag end of the course. So gear ratio will be defined that as the angle as the speed ratio between the sun and the planet. The sun and the planet will have this gear ratio, which is omega a plus omega s divided by omega a minus r s by rp into omega s, small omega s, that is. So this by that is the gear ratio. Now you can see that the gear ratio can be sort of changed by changing the arm speed also. So if I can change the arm speed, I can get different gear ratios I want between the sun and the planet. So gear ratio that now can be controlled independently by controlling the arm speed. If omega a is changed, the gear ratio can be changed. So this is one crucial application, and therefore large range of gear ratio can be obtained in a smaller packing size, and this is exactly the advantage in our typical scooter type of arrangements that we get these days. All the scooters are usually having these automatic transmission, and in these automatic transmission you will get to see a planetary or an epicyclic gear train arrangement. And the way it works there is that you, depending upon which component is getting fixed, you will have a different gear ratio. I will invite you to actually see some of those animations in YouTube or other such sites and grow an insight as to how this offers a definite advantage in terms of specifying different gear ratios by simply fixing different components of your gear train. Okay. So unfortunately it is not possible to show all those animations right here within the constraints of time. So as I said, the planetary gear trains are predominantly found in automatic transmission of different vehicles, whether it is just a scooter or even for the western cars wherein mostly they have automatic transmission, such planetary gear train transmission is prevalently used. Okay, so this time we are just, in the next example we are just complicating things just by a little bit by putting a ring gear, right. So we had the sun, the planet and the arm as usual. Now we have a ring gear which is shown in magenta over here. So usually we will not draw these type of circular diagrams in gear train analysis. What we will draw is sort of the side view of it. This is not again the engineering side view. This is called the Levi schematic diagram of showing a gear train analysis. So through this drawing it should be clear to you that this red is the sun gear, the green is the carrier, and again it should be very clear to you that the red and green both can be given independent motion. The green is not mounted on the red line over here, which means independently the green and the red motion can be controlled. You can give any speed to the green shaft or the arm or the carrier, and on the green you have the red the blue planet. Again you will note that the blue planet is free on the green. So that means that it is not constrained to take up the same velocity as the carrier. The planet does not move at the same velocity as the carrier, it moves at the velocity which is decided by the kinematics of the entire train, right. And finally you have a ring gear which meshes with the planet. So please get accustomed to this Levi schematic drawings. This is again used prevalently in the industrial practices. We rarely use these full blown drawings of this sort as is shown in the right. The Levi schematic drawing will be generally used to represent a gear train arrangement. Now as always we will take our assumption that modules of all the gears are same. So if the modules are same, we will land up into the following condition. The geometry itself says that the radius of the sun plus the diameter of the planet is the radius of the ring. That is, the center of the sun and the center of the ring are exactly the same. They are concentric, which is also very clear from this drawing. The center of the sun and the center of the ring is on the same line. So therefore they are concentric gears. So therefore geometrically you have r sun plus radius of the sun plus diameter of the planet, or twice the radius of the planet must be radius of the ring. But since all of these gears have the same module, we also have the number of teeth in the sun is equals to 2 times number of teeth in the planet is equals to number of teeth in the ring. So this is again one simplistic formula that comes to our fold because we have used the assumption that the module of all gears in my gear train are same. Now with this we can actually just specify the sun and the planet teeths, and the number of teeth on the ring gets automatically specified. So one does not need to specify all the geometry in order to do such gear train analysis. Now let us again use the same logic to come up with the total kinematic analysis of this planetary gear train. So as usual we will break up the analysis into two parts. In the first part we will analyze this system when the arm is fixed. This green arm is fixed. In this condition we are going to analyze this problem. In that case we will see that if the green arm is fixed, it is just like a simple gear train with external gearing as well as internal gearing. So if omega s is the speed of the sun, then the speed of the planet is minus rs by rp into omega s, because the minus sign arises because it is an external gearing. Similarly, the ring gear speed can be determined as the planet gear radius divided by the ring gear radius into planet gear speed, which is rs rp into omega s. So rp divided by rr is the ratio with which the planet gear speed gets magnified or demagnified, and you get the ring gear speed accordingly. Here there is no reversal in sign because this is an internal gearing. So the minus sign which remains in the planet gear, which was there in the planet gear, remains even in the ring gear. But we understand that when arm is fixed, these are the individual motions that are obtained in the sun, the planet and the ring, right. So now in the next condition we try to evaluate what happens when each of these components is just locked with the arm. Again, that is a hypothetical condition, that is not what is practical, but that is just a advantage, that is just an advantageous position that we take for the analysis, because finally we know that it is the relative velocity which matters. The relative velocity, the first line, in the first line what we have done is we have analyzed the motion from the perspective of an observer who is fixed to the arm. And in the next line, therefore, we are adding the motion of the arm itself, so that finally we can evaluate the motion of the entire system as observed by an inertial observer. So when everything is fixed to the arm, the analysis is even simpler, that we get that everything will have the same value. That is, whatever is the arm speed, the sun will also move at the same speed, planet will also move at the same speed, ring will also move at the same speed. So this line of analysis is, that's why I say this is a very simplistic, that when the motion is such that everything is fixed to the arm, it is almost trivial. And when the arm is fixed, the planetary gear train actually reduces to a simple gear train. So that also should be easily deciphered. The third line, the third row of this table essentially is just the summation of these two. So you just add up whatever is there in the first two rows, and the total motion of the arm, for example, is 0 plus omega a, which is omega a. The total motion of the sun is omega s plus omega a. Similarly, the total motion of the planet is determined as an addition of the two cells which are shown here, and similarly the total motion of the ring is shown here. So again we see that there are three unknowns, omega a, omega s, and sorry, there are two unknowns, omega a and omega s, and if any two conditions are given to us, we should be able to determine omega a and omega s, because the total motion of all these four links is finally in terms of omega a and omega s. So given any two of these four motions, the other two can be determined. So if you give me omega a and omega s, I can solve for both. If you give me omega a plus omega s and omega a minus rs by rp omega s, then I can again use two simultaneous equations to just solve out this problem. So any two constituents, if that is known, sun planet or planet ring or arm sun, any pair of two motions, if it is known, then these equations can be used to determine firstly omega s and omega a, and once you know what is omega s and omega a, you can determine everything else of this gear train arrangement. And finally, if you realize that now there are multiple possibilities also, if I have a clutch arrangement and if I hold this ring gear, for example, then I will get in this one condition, which is this equals to 0, and the other will be let's say the sun will be the input. So the sun omega a plus omega s is some constant which is coming from the input. If I use a clutching arrangement on the ring, I will get this quantity to be 0, and using these two relation I will be able to determine the motion of the arm and of the planet. So I can take the arm motion now as that of the output, right. So either I can make the arm fixed through a clutching arrangement and take the input from the sun and output from the ring, or I can just take another clutching arrangement using the same gear train. I can make the clutch engage with the ring gear and thus make it fixed, and when the clutch is remaining fixed, the output will come from the arm. So using the same device, I have the flexibility through a clutching arrangement to attain different gear ratios, and that is exactly what is required in a transmission system to have greater flexibility. If I want a certain gear ratio, I will engage the clutch in a certain manner. If I want another gear ratio, I will engage the clutch in a different manner, and this is exactly what happens when you have something like a conical clutch arrangement in your automatic transmission. Depending upon the speeds, different clutches are getting enforced in different conditions, and accordingly you will have something like this. Once the ring gear is held in the fixity condition, once the planet gear is once the arm gear is arm or the carrier is held in a fixity condition, and accordingly the output can be swapped. So there is no reason to always think that the output will come from the ring gear. There is no reason to think that always the output will come from the planet gear. Input is usually constant because it is coming from the engine. So if the input is constant, then the output can change depending upon which constituent member you are actually holding through your clutching arrangement. So this is why planetary gear trains have found wide applicability in mostly automatic transmissions, wherein they offer the advantage of flexibility. You are able to achieve large gear ratio range using planetary gear train analysis. They are very compact in arrangement. They have very nice properties in terms of dynamics also, because what is usually done is that there will not be just one planet as is shown here. There will be some redundant planets also, redundant in the kinematic sense, because if I use additional planets, they don't serve any kinematic purpose, but they can be very important in balancing the mechanism. So again, the noise vibration characteristics of such gear trains will be very favorable, and therefore they have been prevalently used in different applications. Okay, with that I have come to the end of the talk of gear trains in particular, and also the entire course on gears. We have time remaining. We can take up a few questions for the time that is available, and also if you have further questions we can have some interaction before we call it a day here. BEC is asking about the methods of manufacturing of gear. There are lots of methods. I am not really a manufacturing man, but I know gear milling, gear hobbing, gear cutting. There are so many operations, but manufacturing of gears is not my cup of tea, and it's also not in the purview of this course, which is about kinematics and dynamics of machinery. So this course was about the kinematics of gears, and we have understood the gear teeth geometry and the requirement of gear tooth geometry, and from the kinematics perspective, from the design perspective. Okay, so definitely there are many methods of manufacturing of gears. Please, you will do well to consult any book on manufacturing methodologies to get your question answered. I would not be the right one to discuss manufacturing processes of gears. Okay, any other questions please? Anyone who wishes to have any interaction?
Hello, good afternoon sir.
Good afternoon.
My question is, what is the degree of freedom for epicyclic gear train?
The degree of freedom for epicyclic gear train is 2. You need 2 inputs in order to specify the motion of all the available links in your system, and that should be clear to you from this analysis itself. Here the total motion of the body is determined. The arm is omega a, the sun is omega a plus omega s, planet is omega s plus omega, whatever that formula is. So you need the motion of at least 2 members so that the motion of the other 2 members can be determined. So that essentially means that the degree of freedom of this system is 2. Have I answered your question?
Thank you sir.
Okay, any other questions? CTOR is asking what is the significance of module. Module is the ratio of diameter by number of teeth. As was talked in the first class, module is very important in ensuring that the gear engagement does take place properly. Both gears which are in engagement must have the same module. If both the gears in engagement do not have the same module, then the engagement will not be correctly done. So that is the significance of module, that being a ratio of diameter by number of teeth, it can be very quickly evaluated, and if this module is not the same between the 2 gear pairs which are in engagement, then the engagement will not be properly done. Please refer to the talk on the first session and also one of those slides wherein I have proved that modules of the 2 engaging gears must be identical. If they are not the same, then you will have trouble in that engagement. The engagement will just not occur. So as a requirement for continuous and smooth engagement, the modules have to be same. Please use the course pack to post further questions at least during the semester, so that we can answer your questions. Whatever that is posted, we will get notifications if there are questions posted in the course pack. So we will accordingly answer them for you. Okay, as far as the references are concerned, let me again emphasize that most of the material has been taken from this book on by Ghosh and Malik, Theory of Mechanisms and Machines. Professor Malik's lectures on kinematics of mechanisms, therein there are I think about 5 or 6 lectures on gears. Most portions of this talk will overlap with those video lectures also, so you will be advised to go through these materials also in case you have you wish to refer supplementary materials. Norton's book is probably more palatable in case people have difficulty with Ghosh and Malik. Norton's book is little more user friendly, I would say. It looks bulky, but it's actually easier to read. Shigley's book is also a classic in its own right, Theory of Machines and Mechanisms. So please read any. I would prefer advising you to read one book. Because if you read one book, it should actually be sufficient, and also it will save you from getting confused. Don't dabble with too many books and confuse yourself, because different books will have different notations and different conventions. For example, Shigley does planetary gear train analysis in a slightly different way. He does not advocate the tabular method. Ghosh and Malik advocates the tabular method, and in my experience I have found tabular method as possibly the easiest to follow, and this is probably very robust because the chances of making mistake in the tabular method I feel is minimum. But in case you feel that there are other methods you want to use, please learn those methods and use it, and practice problems associated with those. Some of these problems have already been posted on your course pack. They will be posted probably as assignments to you, so please do them and get yourself comfortable with this. But as I always keep saying that kinematics and mechanisms is possibly best learned with the aid of visualization tools. So presently you will have lots of visualization tools available for free on the web. Ujjwal Rane's website is YouTube channel, I am sorry, is one of my favorites. Please look at it for different kinds of animations, not only of gears but also of different other kinds of mechanisms like 4-bar and slider crank and so on. And the other website which comes to my mind is How Stuff Works. So the automotive transmission animation you will find under that. That's also a YouTube channel. So please look at those animations, and that should be a good aid to sort of reinforce your theoretical understanding. Okay, I don't see any more questions, do I? Okay, there are no more questions, and I don't see anyone hand raise also. So I'll take that as there is no further questions. So if there are no further questions, let me take this opportunity to thank you for your patient listening. I hope I have been able to be of some value in getting you introduced to this field of gear. Obviously, I have not been able to cover all the topics under the sun associated with it. There are full-fledged courses available on gear design and gear dynamics, but if my talk has aroused interest and made you comfortable in this topic of gears, I would feel myself adequately rewarded. So with that, I think I will call it a close as far as my talk goes, but I'll be happy to interact with you guys if you do have questions around this topic of kinematics of gears. The course page definitely will be active for the entire semester. Please post your doubts, and we will be happy to resolve those doubts to the best of our abilities. With that, let me thank you. Have a very good evening ahead. Thank you.